Thank you, Curry. I've been called many things in my life, but a primary source, not one of them. I felt like Curry was going to put me in an exhibit and, have the school kids walk by me and something like I was ossified or anything. But thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And what we're going to do today is to talk about the summit in 1986. We're going to talk about how this summit really was 48 hours that ended the Cold War. And we're going to talk about how exciting it was and how important it was. And that is true for three reasons. Number one, it was exciting because it's a great story. It's almost like an Agatha Christie story about a wooden, creaky, old house in the middle of nowhere. The house thought to be haunted, and still thought to be today haunted. And with rain slashing against the windowsill, over one weekend, two unbelievable characters meet and undergo the most amazing experience. Number two is those two characters. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are two of the most interesting and important characters of the 20th century. And third is the significance. Why this weekend at Reykjavik in 1986 led to the end of the Cold War. Now, I should tell you that Reykjavik was not the first summit between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Reagan era or Gorbachev era. That happened the year before in Geneva. And this was in November of 1985 in Geneva. And it was carefully scripted. There was about a 6 months preparation for the summit. And the reason that there was so much preparation was this was the first summit of Ronald Reagan's, first summit of Mikhail Gorbachev's, and the first U.S.-Soviet summit in 7.5 years. And we decided after careful negotiations with the Russians that it would be an even playing field. There would not be a host or a guest, and therefore it was going to be in a neutral country, Switzerland, a neutral city, Geneva, even a neutral site, a chateau owned by the Aga Khan, not the American embassy or not the Soviet embassy. So everything was going to be neutral. The thing was that a number of us were standing with Ronald Reagan in the hallway of this great chateau, and Reagan was there seemingly without a care in the world. And then the Secret Service said that Mikhail Gorbachev's car was coming around. The most memorable part of this summit happened the first 2 minutes of the summit. And I'm going to show you what happened. Don Regan, who is Chief of Staff of the White House, then explains it. And I want you to pay attention, especially to the Russian comments on what happened those first 2 minutes, the most important minutes of this previous first summit between Reagan and Gorbachev.
We were waiting for General Secretary Gorbachev to arrive. President Reagan was waiting inside the mansion. He had no coat on. He was asked, did he want to put a coat on? And while he was trying to make up his mind, the Secret Service announced that Gorbachev was there. So Reagan said, my heavens. He raced out the door without his overcoat, down the steps, and just as Gorbachev's limousine door opened, there was Reagan with his hand out, ready to greet him. Gorbachev was bundled up in a muffler, hat, overcoat. Reagan then put his hand under Gorbachev's arm and assisted him up the stairs.
I felt that we lost the game during this first movement. You can compare it with a chess game. We started with the wrong move.
I love that. You have to understand that Ronald Reagan at that time was 74 years old, Mikhail Gorbachev 54, so there's a generation difference. And Ronald Reagan looked like $1 million, and Gorbachev, of course, head to foot swaddled in wool on that. So then the next year, the Reykjavik summit came, And unlike the first one, which was planned for, like I said, 6 months, this is planned in about 10 days' time. It was a hurry-up summit, and it was a come-as-you-are summit, and it was not supposed to be a summit at all, in fact. It was just a business meeting between the two heads of state on that time. Here is a cartoon at the time, and Reagan is saying, well, Mick, I can see you're all set for our low-key, one-on-one, non-summit. Ronald Reagan had about 25 professionals with him going there because it was not going to be a big deal. Gorbachev shows up with 300 in his party. So here is the train of the Russians going there. And it was thought to be, when it was first announced as a business meeting and a non-summit, it was thought to be that the press was not going to be very interested in it, and there were going to be no press people, you know, just a few there. Well, by the time the summit opened on October 11th, 1986, there were 3,117 press people accredited to the summit itself. Now, this is taking place in Reykjavik, a city of 125,000, in Iceland, a country of 250,000. So it's kind of in the middle of nowhere with a facility that was ill-equipped to be the center of the earth at that one weekend. Here is the Prime Minister of Iceland, okay? I think it's the only nationwide broadcast of an interview done in a Speedo. And what happened was that the press descended on Iceland, and Tom Brokaw, right there, wanted an interview with the Prime Minister. He said, when would the Prime Minister be available? And the Prime Minister's office said, whenever Tom Brokaw will be available, I'll be available. And so he chose a time that was the normal time for the Prime Minister's bath in the thermal springs, of which there are lots in Reykjavik. And his press guy, for some reason, didn't tell him a bathrobe would be better, or, you know, a towel would I recommend. So I think, as I say, it's the only nationwide broadcast done in a Speedo by a head of government that I've ever seen anyway. This is Miss World. She is an Iceland. She was crowned the month before the summit. She was in Asia on a goodwill tour and called back for the summit. I thought personally, when writing this book, that she'd be terrific to put on the cover of the book, and we could call it 50 Shades of Ice or something like that. And maybe with her on the cover, name it something like, you know, Sex, Dieting, Cats, and something in Reykjavik, and, you know, to hit all the search engines that could make this a bestseller book on that. But somehow the publisher didn't think having her on the cover was exactly, you know, to point on what the whole book was all about. But she was not the only beautiful woman in Reykjavik that weekend. This is Raisa Gorbachev. Now, as I told you before, there was a summit in Geneva in 1985, the year before Reykjavik, and the two first ladies were there. Needless to say, before too long, they didn't get along all that well with each other. In fact, I had a friend one time who was in Washington, high in government, and he went to Bob Strauss, head of the Democratic Party at that time, said, you know what, I don't understand why everybody takes such an instantaneous dislike of me. And Strauss thought for a minute, he says, well, because it saves them time. Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev took an instantaneous dislike to each other. I think it saved them time. And because this was going to be a summit, a non-summit, a business meeting, that Nancy Reagan decided to stay home. And she was also informed by the Russians that Raisa Gorbachev would not be there in Reykjavik. The plane door opens on October 9th, and there is Raisa Gorbachev. She had the stage to herself. Why is that? Because of the 2 days of the summit, there was a news blackout. So there was no news at all from the summit. Nancy Reagan was not there. There's nothing much to report in Reykjavik because nothing ever happens in Reykjavik. And Raisa was there. And Raisa knew that this was her moment to shine. The first day of the summit, she changed her outfit 4 times during the day, which seems a little robust, but anyway, she did that. And then she visited 8 tourist sites in Reykjavik that first day, which is about 6 more than the city had to offer. And there she is, and just did a great job commanding the stage. This is the day before the summit opens. President Reagan with the president of Iceland at that time, and she was the first elected female president in the world. And during that walk that they took together, she says to Reagan, Mr. President, there is no school teaching us how to be a president of our country. But I think the best preparation we can have is in theater, because it teaches you about relationships, it teaches you about values, it teaches you about what's important for society. And Ronald Reagan loved that idea. And he called her ever after that time, he said, there's my old colleague, and lit up whenever he saw her. Second wonderful thing about this photo is, of course, Reagan's coat. It must have come from some 1930s movie set of all that. And it is quite unique. In fact, it's so unique that I never saw him wear it again, either before, after at Reykjavik, or anywhere else. And as I was out at the Reagan Library a few months ago, and they have a whole staff of people doing photos during the Reagan years. And I said, I will give $50 if any of you find one photo of Ronald Reagan in that coat at any other time than this walk at Reykjavik. And no one's ever contacted me. So it's kind of unique and it's kind of spooky, but so much of what happened at Reykjavik was unique and spooky. Here is where the 2 of the leaders met. It's called the Hofty House. It is a wooden structure. It was sold by the British government because the British ambassador said it was haunted. They had ghosts going around. He saw them, he heard them, he felt them, he smelled them, and all. And even today in the neighborhood, it's called the Ghost House. This is among the people who believe in such things. At the time of the Reykjavik, some 55% of all Icelanders believed in leprechauns and elves and ghosts of one kind or another. As you can see, the house is small compared to the car, and it is totally isolated in a city that's isolated, in the country that's isolated, in the island that's isolated, right there. And so it's really in the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful house, one of the few wooden houses in the whole country, and it's absolutely symmetrical, as you can see. This was the Russian parlor on the 2nd floor. This is the American parlor. We'll see the inside of that in a bit. And this is the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between the 2. This is kind of a dining area. This is where the 2 met for 10.5 hours over the weekend, which is a very long time to meet, 4 sessions. And to me, the most unique part happened in the basement. The basement was divided in half. Again, a very small area. It's divided in half. Half was the KGB, and half was the Secret Service and the CIA. And both of them had their equipment up to the sky, the latest equipment for communications and protection and everything like that. And they were just kind of crammed in the basement together with their equipment. Now, the basement had this open area, and it also had 2 bathrooms. Unfortunately, one was larger than the other. And I say unfortunately because they had kind of a conflict the day before the summit opens on who got the nicer bathroom. Okay? They went back and forth, and finally the head of the KGB, much to his glory, said, oh, just to heck with it, let's just see what happens and do it, and see, what becomes of it tomorrow. And so what I like to say is that intelligence agencies from around the world generally operate on a need-to-know basis. The two main intelligence agencies from around the world that day at Reykjavik operated on a need-to-go basis. This is the setting. This is the Hofty House. And it says, you know, they say this house is haunted. You want spooky, check out the place next door. And that's, of course, the arms race. And the arms race was raging in the 1980s. It is impossible for me to convince my kids now that there was a real fear of Armageddon. There was a real fear of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout most of my adult lifetime. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and at Bryn Mawr Grammar School on Tuesday morning at 10:30 in the morning, we were marched in the hall. We went down the hall at 10:30 on Tuesday morning, put our knees on the ground, put our heads in our locker to get ready for a Soviet nuclear attack. I remember asking Miss Mulroy, our teacher, how do we know that the Russians are going to attack on Tuesday morning at 10:30, Chicago time? And she said, no, everybody had thought about that, and that was, you know, it had been well planned out. I said, oh, okay. And then I said, I have another question. I understand my head's in the locker, but my fanny's still in the hall. Won't my fanny get burnt? She says, no. As long as your head is in the locker, that was fine. And besides, stop asking questions. So that was, but the arms race really was going, and it was a big fear of people. You had the day after the ABC program. You have on the beach. You have all kinds of literature and a feeling that there could be a doomsday out there. This is on Saturday morning, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan there, and Reagan greeting him at the Hofty House, both looking awfully good, and then going into the room where they would meet for 10.5 hours over the weekend. This is Gorbachev, this is Reagan, this is Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union at the time. He died about 2 months ago. And this is George Shultz, Secretary of State at the time, who is still going strong. Shultz came to a book party for me this summer in San Francisco, and 93 remembered everything from that weekend. We really had a wonderful time, the two of us, talking about it. Here is a translator for the president. Here is a translator for Gorbachev. And these are the knees that are important, because that's the note taker for the Russians, and there's a note taker for the Americans right here. Why is that important? Because in the time since 1986, the notes have been declassified, both the American notes and the Russian notes of what happened. So we now know exactly what they said to each other during that 10.5 hours. And to me, it is a gold mine, because here was President Reagan, who most of the time in office gets terribly scripted on what he should say and what he should do minute by minute. But here at Reykjavik, he was on his own. He didn't have talking points. He didn't have staff involvement. Shultz and Shevardnadze practically said nothing over the 10.5 hours that they met. They didn't have briefing memos. So you get to know Reagan really raw. You get to see his mind at work. You get to see his character in play. And the same for Mikhail Gorbachev. What they say to each other really comes from them and reflects their views. And you get to get a feel for them in a way that I don't believe any other episode in history enables you to do. After the first session on Saturday morning, this is a photo of that first session on Saturday morning, Secretary Shultz invited us to go into the bubble. Now, a bubble is a room within a room in an embassy overseas that has walls about this thick with all kinds of things in the wall to make sure it's absolutely secure, so that there can be no penetration to listening devices in that room. In Geneva, our bubble sat with a conference table, about 25 of us. okay, for the arms talks in Geneva. In Reykjavik, because nothing ever happened and none of it was ever classified, it was the smallest bubble in the world. So there was 4 seats on one side, 4 seats on the other, and the seats were these gray folding steel chairs, the cheapest money could buy, that Walmart would not even sell these days. And they had a big kind of vault-like lock to put us in this. So we were sitting in there, kind of shoulder to shoulder, knees to knees, when Secretary Schultz was telling us about what had happened that first morning. And all of a sudden the vault opens up and the Secret Service calls out, President of the United States. We all do what you do when you hear that. We all stood up. And now there was 8 of us, belly to belly and nose to nose. And in comes the president walking in. And as he's walking in, he says, you know what we should do is fill this up with water, and this would be awfully good as an aquarium later on. So we thanked him for his wise counsel. And now in the bubble we had a problem. And the problem was we had 8 seats, and we now had 9 people. And, you know, President of the United States is President of the United States. He's not going anywhere. Secretary of State, he's not going anywhere. The Chief of Staff of the White House, he's there to stay. The National Security Advisor, he's there to stay. And while I was not exactly chopped liver, nor was I at the top of this food chain. So I decided if I was going to stay in the bubble, and I decided I was going to stay in the bubble, I had to do something quick. So I said, right here, Mr. President, and I gave him my little chair, and then I hit the ground and sat there, gently leaning against the presidential knees for the next 40 minutes. Months after the Reykjavik summit, a British TV station, Anglican TV, did a reenactment of Reykjavik, and it included this scene.
Mikhail Gorbachev surprised the world when he proposed a preparatory summit meeting at Reykjavik with Ronald Reagan. Their talks launched the superpowers on a new path towards the first agreements ever to cut their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. What follows is a dramatization of the inside story of Reykjavik.
All right, let's get into the bubble.
Mr. President, when are you going to raise human rights?
Well, he spent the whole morning here on arms control. I should respond on that.
Mr. President, if you start with human rights, for sure you're going to end up with arms control. But if you start on arms control, you're going to stay on arms control, so human rights will get squeezed out.
Thanks, Ken. George, we can't have just one working party. We want a second group on the other things, human rights, Afghanistan, bilateral issues.
I was told later that that was kind of the high point of that actor's career, which I always felt kind of sorry for him for that. That was a reenactment. Right now, after the publication of my book, there is a movie in the works with Michael Douglas playing Reagan, and he claims to be the one actor in the world who can go from Liberace to Ronald Reagan, which is probably true, and a wonderful Icelandic director, Baltasar Komaker. And so that is in the works, and they have time reserved for the spring to be filming Reagan at Reykjavik, which is really good news to get the story out on that. Here is the lunch after that bubble episode, and what's interesting about this is there's the young Ken Adelman, there's President, the Chief of Staff, and Max Kampelman, Secretary Schultz, and National Security Advisor. This was taking place in the ambassador's residence where the president was staying. I told you it was a hurry-up summit. The day before the summit was announced, the Secret Service went to the U.S. ambassador, a very nice man named Nick Rui, in Reykjavik, and said, we have big news for you. There's going to be a summit in 10 days' time, and the president's going to be staying in your house. And Nick Rui, the ambassador, said, oh my God, I was so honored. That's just wonderful. Secret Service says, well, the bad news is you're not. So he was kicked out of his house for the president and his party. By the time the ambassador knew that he needed to find a room, there were no rooms in the city. The KGB, the State Department, the Secret Service, and the news organization had gobbled up all the rooms that were there, and that consequently the ambassador had absolutely no place to stay, and he left town. And so the only really important thing to ever happen in U.S.-Iceland relations for all these years happened without the U.S. ambassador being anywhere around that. Meanwhile, while the men were meeting, Raisa Gorbachev was going around town changing outfits and lecturing people who were in their thermal springs about world peace. And the news organizations, you have to understand, they had spent a fortune on getting these people, their representative, up to Reykjavik, because it's A, a long ways to go, because it had, B, it has no facilities for broadcasting out of there. And so they had to set up all this stuff. So they spent thousands and tens of thousands of dollars on the summit, on the non-summit meeting, and had nothing to report. And so they wanted to have something to report, so all there was in motion was Raisa Gorbachev going around town because of the news blackout and because of the absence of Nancy Reagan on that. So she played it to the hilt and really was on display. Meanwhile, the men were meeting, and they had two big subjects. One was the reductions of nuclear weapons, which for the first time the Soviets would go along with. And the second was SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, that Reagan absolutely loved, that Gorbachev absolutely couldn't stand, okay? And this is for a cartoon at the time. Gorbachev says, and anyway, we don't think such a crazy thing could ever work. You got a light? Reagan says, sure. He contacts the SDI unit in space, boom. And Reagan, with his funny little face, says, the Star Wars stuff drives him nuts, as it really did. Saturday night, there was partly a street protest. There was partly a street festival in downtown Reykjavik with Joan Baez in person giving a performance. During the day, Reagan suggested to Gorbachev that the experts meet at the Hofty House at night. So at 8 o'clock at night, we headed to the Hofty House, dark and lit up beautifully in the dark right there and looking absolutely magnificent. And we met with the Russians from 8 o'clock at night. We took a brief break at 3:15 in the morning, and we adjourned at 6:20 the next morning. And we informed the president in the bubble that we had made more progress on reducing nuclear weapons that one night than we had in 7.5 years of dealing with the Russians before that time. Partly that was the reason for that was Gorbachev really wanted the reduction of nuclear weapons. Partly it was because the climate was such that they were scared about SDI and the United States prowess. And partly it was because of this man named Sergei Akromayoff. He was a 5-star marshal in the Soviet Union. Our last 5-star was Omar Bradley. He was chief of staff of the entire Soviet armed forces. 6 months after Reykjavik, we were in Geneva and we were negotiating all day, and at night, Shevardnadze gave a dinner for us, and he was sitting across the table from dinner, and I said, Marshal Akromayoff, can you tell us a little about your story? We've read something about you. All of us had known his name. None of us before Reykjavik had ever met him, including the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. Spent 2 years and never met the man. We all knew that this was one of the key people of the leadership. So that day in Geneva, at the dinner, he tells us that at the age of 17, he joined the army because his mother was single, and he was raised by her, always single, and they were very poor. He then joined the army at 17. At 18, he was stationed on the road to Stalingrad. And for 18 months, lived on that road, keeping the German Northern Panzer Division out of Stalingrad. And for 18 months, he never went inside a building. He had a little pup tent. He and his little battalion right there prevented the Nazis from going into Stalingrad right there. And during that 18 months, the winter got down to 20, 22 below zero. And he never went into a building, stayed in the pup tent. Most of his colleagues in that army, in that tank unit, were killed. He had shrapnel throughout his body and lost his hearing in one ear, but he survived on that. Then what happened was he really took no nonsense at Reykjavik when other members of his delegation were trying to badmouth the United States and kind of harangue about it. He cut them off that night and said, no, we're here just to do business. I kept up with him over the years. In 1989, I was in Moscow at a conference. I was out of government by then, and found out that he was in the Kremlin, not as chief of staff of the armed forces, but as Gorbachev's military advisor. So I wrote a little note, can I see him? He wrote back immediately, come in, I'd love to see you. He showed me around his office on the 3rd floor of the Kremlin. He showed me his chandelier right in his office and everything else around that. And then when the Soviet Union was starting to disintegrate in 1991, I got up one morning in September 26, 1991, read the Washington Post at 6:30 in the morning, and in an article actually buried in the 6th paragraph of an article about what was happening in the Soviet Union, there's the notice that Marshal Akromayoff committed suicide over the weekend. He had hung himself on that chandelier, and he wrote a note saying that everything he ever stood for was now gone with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. I immediately was amazed out of my mind. Colin Powell, who had been with us for a lot of the arms control activities, was then Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So I called his office. His secretary said he was already in briefings, this being about 6:45 in the morning. I said, fine, and just have him call Ken Adelman. And she said, hold on a minute. A minute later, he picks up, Kenny, I couldn't believe it either. And we started talking about Akromayoff. And we talked about how he really was a noble man in what I considered an ignoble cause, but a very honorable and dedicated and patriotic man and decent human being. After that phone call, we thought to ourselves, nothing worse can happen to Akromayoff, but it did. He had a funeral. There was a funeral for him 2 days later. His wife and 2 daughters show up, but almost nobody else. There was no bugle. There was no honor guard. This is the most decorated man in Soviet history. He remains the most decorated man in Soviet history. There was no representative of the government there at all. And then a week later, vandals dig up his body from the tomb and steal his uniform and leave his body there exposed. So it was just an awful, awful ending to somebody who served his country well and who was a real hero during the Reykjavik weekend. Here is Sunday afternoon. We're in a bind because the summit has gone overtime. It was supposed to end at noon on Sunday. that this is sudden death overtime. We're proposing a paper right there that can compromises and allows us to make deep reductions in nuclear weapons, but still have SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. When Ronald Reagan came up, this is the second floor at Hofty House. When Ronald Reagan came up to the second floor, he sat in the corner about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he said, you know what? I'm going to go down there one more time to meet with Gorbachev, and then that's it. He was tired. He's a 75-year-old man at that point, and he had been going since 8 o'clock in the morning on all of Saturday, and this was Sunday afternoon. And then he said, I'm just going to go one more time because Nancy expects me home for dinner. I promised her I'd be home for dinner. I tried to explain to him, I said, Mr. President, you know, she's going to know where you are. It's not like you're up to no good or stopped in the bar on the way there. And he says, I know, but I just promised her. We came up with a compromise. He left. As he was leaving, we all said, good luck, Mr. President. We knew it was a big moment in his life, big moment in our lives, big moment in American history. And within 15 seconds, he comes back in the room. And he has us in a circle right there. And we said, what's that? He didn't even have time to go downstairs. And he said, I just want to make sure that we're doing right by America. I just want to make sure that we're not getting carried away in that. Because with all the summit fever, with the 3,117 journalists standing on the lawn, with all the razzmatazz that goes, that we could lose our heads and start chasing something that wasn't good for us. So we told him, yes, it was very good for us. He went down. Gorbachev would not buy it. He wanted to kill SDI, and that was it. Reagan was mad. He wrote in his diary that night, it's the angriest day of his presidency, and it was. He was furious. He walks Gorbachev to the curb. Gorbachev says to him, well, Mr. President, I don't know what we could have done differently. And Reagan says, well, you could have said yes, and pokes his finger right in his chest. We went over to the ambassador's house. We saw Reagan by the time we got there, and the president couldn't sit down, and no one talked to him because he was pacing back and forth. His face was all red and kind of furious with what had happened. He believed he came so close to getting a historic agreement. The world said it was a failure, and Time magazine came out with a separate edition. When Reagan went from there to Keflavik, the airport that was 30 miles outside of town, he greeted American troops there. There was a NATO base. And the whole time he was going out there, he was still furious. And by the only time that he could control, he controlled himself, but he was just really angry. But once he got to Keflavik, stood in front of the troops, he became Ronald Reagan once again. He saw all those servicemen and women and their families right there, and he addressed them and even ended up saluting them for their tribute on that. That was in 1986. It was thought to be, the summit was thought to be a failure, and but early in 1987, we started really getting a lot of progress on arms control, and we were going strong in June. In June, the president goes for the 750th anniversary of Berlin, and he makes a speech. During that time, the first few months of 1987, 87, right after Reykjavik in 86, during those first few months, there's a tremendous fight in the White House and the administration because the speechwriters find out that Ronald Reagan wants to say something that's very provocative during that 750th anniversary in Berlin, and no one, virtually no one in his administration wants him to talk. But he goes and he decides what he's going to say, and on his own, he says it.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
One of my favorite parts of the book is a little section that describes the origin of this speech, because virtually, like I say, no one in his administration wanted him to say it. Even in the limo going over to the speech at the Berlin Wall, the vice head, the deputy chief of staff of the White House, says, well, Mr. President, you know, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with you talking like that. And Reagan just looks at him and says, well, I just think it's the right thing to do. And then goes back to daydreaming out the window. And so those are the 5 most memorable and important words of his administration that he decided were the right thing to do. It was feared at the time that if he was going to challenge Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, and even worse, use his name in that part, that it would ruin the arms control talks. Okay? But the fact was, it didn't ruin the arms control talks at all. We raced ahead, and in December of 1987, a year after Reykjavik, had a treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev could sign. The Reagans invited the Gorbachevs to Washington, D.C., and they came to Washington, D.C., and here is the welcoming ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. Here are the 2 first ladies. You can see how warm and cozy they felt with each other, and their affection and their feelings, anyway, towards each other. This is, again, at the welcoming ceremony. You can imagine when they were unwelcoming each other, what it was like. The 2 men, actually, it was years ago yesterday, December 8th or 9th, the 2 men signed this treaty. This is the cabinet, and this is Schultz is right there, Vice President Bush is right there, Shevardnadze is right there, some of the Russians, Akromayoff is right there. Second row is that familiar row of KGB officers and CIA. In the third row, the worker bees, there's Colin Powell, Paul Nitze, myself, Max Kampelman, and others, and these are the leaders of Congress and all. What happened was that this Reykjavik led deep cuts in nuclear missiles. They agreed to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. It's never been done since. Then 2 sides agreed to deep cuts in long-range nuclear missiles, and Reagan never had to give up SDI as Gorbachev wanted. And this is a little chart I just did on nuclear stockpiles through the generations. You can see the turning point came at Reykjavik, and we're at a level of about 1/4 that we were at the time of Reykjavik. It's been an amazing, amazing decline in nuclear arsenals since that time. Here, Reagan and Gorbachev signing that treaty. That was in 1987. Then in 1988, Ronald Reagan gives a speech in Moscow. I love this, with a hammer and sickle and Lenin's 6-foot tomb, and he talks about freedom and free enterprise and how important it is on that. And so that's a tremendous visit that he has in '88. And of course, the next year, what happens? This is the night before he leaves. This is a 4-day summit, and the president is running around town the whole time, meeting with Gorbachev. And the last night of the summit, the Gorbachevs have a state dinner for the Reagans, and then bring them to the Bolshoi Ballet. And after 4 days of being run around, now a 75-year-old man, Reagan seen after midnight at Red Square, and some of the press goes up to him and says, Mr. President, what are you doing here? And he says, well, we're leaving tomorrow, and I didn't want Nancy to leave town without seeing this. So he just wanted her to see the Red Square at night. And that's 1989. Of course, the next year, what happens is the fall of the wall. Here's a beautiful portrait, photo of Rostropovich, who was in Paris, heard about the fall of the wall, rushed to Berlin and in front of the wall and said, all I need is a chair. And someone provided him his chair. He took out his cello and he played Bach for 2 hours. Bach on unaccompanied cello to express the emotion that he felt on the fall of the wall. And then just a few months later, Leonard Bernstein, the last year of his life, came to lead the orchestra in the Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy, with East Berlin, West Berlin, France, England, United States, and Russia on that. It was a magnificent thing in 1989. We were just blown out of our minds on that could happen. And then, of course, in 1991, the big news came with the fall of the Soviet Union. This is the flag coming off the head of the Kremlin. On the flight to Detroit, Ronald Reagan's asked, why are you doing this, Ron? Why do you want to be president? To end the Cold War, Reagan says. In the 70s, Reagan envisioned how that would happen. We win, they lose. Christmas Day, 1991, the flag of the Union was lowered, ended the Cold War. We won, and they lost. And what happened was the 48 hours at Reykjavik ended the Cold War, because at Reykjavik, Gorbachev became increasingly fearful that SDI showed our prowess and our technological lead. He accelerated Gorbachev, when he got back, accelerated the reforms in the Soviet Union, and he wanted the Soviet Union to be reformed, and the system was too antiquated and too rigid to be reformed, and instead it collapsed, thus ending the Cold War. That was in 1991. In 1994, Ronald Reagan takes out a piece of paper from his desk and writes a letter to the American people, just on his own, with words misspelled, with parts of it crossed out, and it's the last communications that President Reagan has with the American people.
November 5th, 1994. My fellow Americans, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the time comes, I am confident that with your help, she will face it with faith and courage. In closing, let me thank you, the American people, for giving me the great honor of allowing me to serve as your president. When the Lord calls me home, whenever that may be, I will leave the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan.
That's a beautiful letter. Soon after that, the Iceland government asked a number of us to go back to Iceland for the 10th anniversary, 1996. And I was blown away by the emotion I felt going into the parlor, going into the ambassador's house, returning to the bubble. And overwhelmed by a feeling that a pilgrim must have going to a holy site. And on the way back from the Hofty House one afternoon, I went from there, going around and seeing that parlor, seeing where the two of them met, where we waited for the president in the corner right there, going, seeing the basement where all the equipment had been. And I wrote a postcard just like that. And I didn't know who I was, the address of the recipient, but I knew who I was writing it to. 2 weeks later, I was at the Reagan Library in California, and there walking down the hall was Nancy Reagan, Mrs. Reagan. So I went up to her, I said that I had been to Reykjavik for the 10th anniversary. She said she understood that Maureen had been there and told her that I was there. And I said that, Mrs. Reagan, I wrote your husband a postcard from there. She looked at me, startled, a little aggravated, and didn't you know that he doesn't read postcards these days? Don't you know his condition? And anyway, after expressing her feeling of being startled, she said, well, what'd you say? And I said, well, I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something like, Dear Mr. President, I'm here on the 10th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, thinking back on the tremendous job you did for America and how very proud I was to serve you. My best to you, Ken Adelman. So I mailed that, told her that, and she burst out crying, and I have to say, I joined her in that for a very special moment we had, thinking back on a very special person. A few years later, what Nancy Reagan called the long goodbye finally came, and Ronald Reagan was honored in the Capitol building. During the motorcade, here are some firemen lowering the flag and saluting the funeral procession. Here's the casket with the flag taken off on that. My wife and I were very, very lucky to be included in the funeral at the National Cathedral. And it was a beautiful, moving ceremony in June of 2004. And we were very emotionally moved by the whole thing. But we were even more emotionally moved by what happened the day before. That was unannounced and unanticipated. Landing at Washington National Airport was a plane containing Mikhail Gorbachev, who went from the airport right to the Capitol building, where the body was lying in state. He was recognized there. He was brought up inside the honor guard. He stood for a few minutes away from the casket, thinking, looking, and then he went up to the casket, and later that night in an interview said, I gave it a few pats, and then he rubbed his hand up and down the stripes of the red and white flag covering the casket of the 40th President of the United States. I thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions for you now. Yes, sir.
How did Gorbachev and Nazi actually dissolve the Soviet Union? What was the mechanism there?
The mechanism there is explained in chapter 10 of the book. So I don't want to hurt sales by telling you, okay? But the fact is that what happened was that they really did fear SDI and the technological prowess of the United States. They wanted to reform the Soviet Union. As someone said, they wanted to reform the Soviet Union in the worst possible way, and that's exactly how they did it. And the Soviet system couldn't be reformed like that, and it started to crumble. And then the individual republics bowed out of the Soviet Union. They withdrew from it. So that kind of process is described there, and it's a unique process in history, that an empire would crumble without a war involved at all. Yeah?
Tell me if my assumption is correct, that Reagan initiated the acceleration of arms race
You are partly right. I say partly because there's more to the story. Real quickly, what Ronald Reagan did was awfully unique. He had an overall strategy on what he wanted to accomplish in office, okay? I didn't know till I did research on this book that by 1980, when he's going to Detroit for the convention, and Stuart Spencer says, Ron, why are you doing this? Why do you want to be president? He says, to end the Cold War. Well, none of us thought it was going to end. And then, years before, he got in his own mind anyway, how it was going to end. We win, they lose. Okay? So he had an overall strategy. Then he had, below that, he had 4 steps to implement that strategy. A strategy is nothing without steps to implement. Number 1, exactly what you said. We are going to have a buildup, and the Soviet Union is going to have trouble matching us. Number 2, we're going to delegitimize the Soviet system. That's the evil empire, the focus of evil in the modern world. Marxism is going to end up on the ash heap of history, that constant kind of barrage that it's an illegitimate system. Number 3, real reductions in nuclear capabilities, to which Gorbachev bought on at Reykjavik. Okay? And that's number 3. Number 4, SDI, to show our technological prowess to protect America from incoming ballistic missiles. And then, besides the strategy and the 4 implementing steps, he had tremendous courage to see it through during a lot of opposition in his first term. So that was his overall approach. It worked better than he would ever have imagined. And thank God he saw part of that. Yeah, please.
Was there any other fear that at some point when Soviet Union realized they couldn't compete technologically with espionage and terrorism, that there was a fear of the Soviet?
Yeah, there was a fear of that. It was not a high fear, but there was a fear. Yeah, please.
Is it really correct that the CIA and our intelligence agencies had no idea that the Soviet Union
Yeah.
was going to fall?
The question is, was it really correct that the CIA and the intelligence agency had no idea that the Soviet Union was going to fall?
So what?
And the answer is yes. But let me give you the counter-argument. The KGB had no intelligence that the Soviet Union was going to fall either. The Politburo of the Soviet Union did not know it was going to fall. And the CIA, the KGB did no better job in intelligence. You'll see in the book that the estimates of the KGB on where SDI was, the Strategic Defense Initiative, were vastly exaggerated, vastly. And then Gorbachev exaggerated that. So Reagan and Gorbachev talked about SDI like it was deployed already, like it was the biggest threat in the world. It was a small research program in the Pentagon at that time. So if your overall point is that the CIA did a bad job at predicting the fall of the Soviet Union, you're absolutely right. If your overall point is everybody did a bad job and the intelligence is lacking on both sides, you're right on that too. Yeah, please. Yeah. What happened with SDI was typical Ronald Reagan. He goes in 1979, he is preparing to be president. He had just been governor of California, and he's kind of boning up on foreign affairs. He goes into Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD, which is the North American command, the United States and the Canadians hold, and you walk in there and it's a Dr. Strangelove world. It's fantastic. I've been there, and some of you may probably have too. See big screens everywhere on measuring and detecting any incoming ballistic missiles into the United States. Everybody walks out of there absolutely amazed and startled by all the technology and the prowess, and Ronald Reagan walked out of there baffled. He says, okay, supposing all this lights up like a Christmas tree, what happens then? Well, the commanding general, James Hill, said, well, Governor, see these phones, I pick up that phone and it gets to the White House, I pick up that, it's command around the world, I pick up that. And Ronald Reagan says, okay, but what do they do? Well, they pick up their phone and, you know, it's the equivalent of everybody saying, holy cow, to everybody else, you know. And he says, well, shouldn't there be something to protect us so that people aren't just calling each other saying, holy cow, and that this is real serious? And shouldn't there be some kind of device so that the United States can be protected? That's the origin of SDI. He launched it a few years later when he was in the Oval Office. Gorbachev knew that they could not keep up with that, and it really made him accelerate his reforms. The kind of spin-off from SDI, there have been very good successes in miniaturization, everything like that. There were tests last summer on incoming ballistic missiles that proved very well. We saw in Israel that Iron Dome, or a tactical level, worked very well during the Hamas conflict. And, you know, I'm still thinking that it's a very good idea. Any president in the future needs a third option. If, God forbid, there's a nuclear incoming against the United States, now the two, as of this day, the two options are to take it and say you're awfully sorry about it, which seems, you know, awfully inadequate. Number two, to retaliate against the country and the people that had nothing to do and probably didn't know anything about any of this, North Korea and Iran or something like that. And those two alternatives are terrible. And it's terrible to put our leaders in that. And the third alternative, why don't we just protect the country the best we can, which is a lot easier to do with one or two attacks than hundreds coming in from the Soviet Union. That kind of you know, capability, I think, is wonderful. And I think it's well worth it. And I think Ronald Reagan was way ahead of his time on thinking about that. Let's have two more, and then I want to do one last little present to you all. Right there, please. It took a little while. Well, the simple answer is he didn't. He didn't, okay? And one of, again, my favorite parts of this book, how it was all a terrible mistake. What happened was the East Germans protest, people in East Germany, and especially Berlin, were protesting a lot in November of 1989. And it got to be kind of overwhelming. Honecker, the dictator of East Germany for, I don't know, 20 years before that time, was out. There was kind of a reform group in there, but they didn't show any reform at that time. And one of the new members of the cabinet was a spokesman who really had no experience, but he looked good on television and he sounded pretty good. And the new cabinet met, and they were working out that there were going to be new travel rules for East Germans sometime in the future, but the news of that was embargoed, and exactly how they would change the rules, no one knew at the time. So it was all pretty fuzzy. The new spokesman goes out and he says, there are going to be new rules on travel to the West by the East Germans. And some news guy says, well, when are they going to take place? And he doesn't know anything. He says, well, now. All right? So he's wrong on making it kind of specific. He's wrong on saying it's now. And then the crowds assemble. The border guards don't know what to do. They can no longer start shooting these people again. And so the wall opens up. It was all just a big mistake. But it was typical of the Soviet Union. Things were sloppy. Things were, you know, and kind of ragtag on that. All right, our last question, please, sir.
Why did Gorbachev choose Reagan?
Because he offered Reagan two alternatives. He wanted a quickie summit. He thought the arms talks were absolutely hobbled, which they were. He wanted to get things going, which was a good sentiment. And he offered Reagan London or Reykjavik, because they were equal distance from the United States, from Moscow and Washington. So both of them would travel the equal distance. Reagan said, oh my God, if I go to London, I have to see the Queen, I have to see Thatcher, I have to see the cabinet, I got NATO, a bunch of stuff there. if I go to Reykjavik, there's nothing there, all right? So I'm fine. So he wrote back immediately, he says, let's go to Reykjavik. And Gorbachev said, great. I have one last treat for you, and that is, I would love your cooperation. You're great questions, great audience. If those of you who have served in the United States Army could just stand up for 1 minute. Let's give them an applause. Those in the Navy, join them. The U.S. Navy, stand up and just join them. Thank you. Those in the Marines, stand up, join them. Those in the Air Force, stand up, join you. Anybody in the federal government, stand up and thank you for your service. And I have a little treat for you in particular. This is Ronald Reagan talking at his 1981 inauguration. And this is dedicated to all of you who have served. Thank you.
If we look to the answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. The sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with its row upon row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David, they add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Each one of those markers is a monument to the kind of hero I spoke of earlier. Their lives ended in places called Belleau Wood, the Argonne, Omaha Beach, Salerno, and halfway around the world on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pork Chop Hill, the Chosin Reservoir, and in 100 rice paddies and jungles of a place called Vietnam. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job in a small-town barber shop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. There on the Western Front, he was killed trying to carry a message between battalions under heavy artillery fire. We're told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf, under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever. We are Americans.
Thank you very much for being here, and God bless.